right, Herle Burlyites, assemble. I'm not going to beat around the bush. We have a hell of a show today. In the dubious 3 years and change history of this show, we've been lucky enough to have 2 former prime ministers as guests. And today, I'm thrilled that we make it 3. We have the Right Honourable Joe Clark with us, Canada's 16th and youngest prime minister when he defeated Pierre Trudeau in 1979. You all know Mr. Clark, son of High River Alberta, and his almost 25-year career in Parliament. I'm not going to read a bio because we'll cover it, much of it over the coming hour. We're also going to get Mr. Clark's thoughts on some of his accomplishments in public life and some of the contemporary issues that we're dealing with in political parties and protests and divisions around the country. But I would like to tell you this about Joe Clark, which is nobody, and I worked with Mr. Turner, nobody has shown more grace and class and dignity through their political career, no matter what trials and tribulations were thrown at them, than has Joe Clark. Mr. Clark, thank you so much for coming on the show today. It's a real honor for me to have you here.
Thank you. Look forward to it.
So, how are you?
I want to check. How am I doing on grace and honor? Am I still in the
yes, you're still doing fine.
Don't push me, dear. I'm doing well, thank you. I don't like being locked down. Nobody does. I'm a little alarmed, more alarmed than I usually am at the state of our country and our world. But and it's heavy snow on my ground. But apart from that, I'm just fine.
Where do we find? I think we all share that mentality. Where do we find you today?
I'm in Ottawa. We're living in Ottawa, in an increasing snowdrift, which they say will gradually dissipate.
Well, there's a lot of trucks there.
Yeah, fewer, I guess. I'm not going to say where I am in case they find me, but I don't think they're looking.
Yeah. There is so much to talk about today and so little time to do it. Can we start with a little biography? I like to know where people come from, especially how they got involved in politics. What was it like growing up in High River in the 50s and 60s? What was
it was a very small town. I'm surprised at how all the little towns are now becoming cities in Alberta. And we were certainly a small town. My grandfather had come there and just after Alberta became a province. That meant that the Clarks were never members officially of the Old Timers Association of Alberta, which I greatly regret. He, in fact, was a newspaper man. He had a very interesting career. He served in South Africa in the Boer War. He came from a big family. His own brother was a journalist back in Garden, Ontario. But he moved around. He settled roots in High River. He built a very good community newspaper, which my dad ran for a long time. My mom was a teacher there. And I had, in retrospect, I had an excellent growing up. I was in a very small place. You'd know about that. You come from one too. And you don't realize what you're
The town I grew up in didn't get running water till 1967. Can you beat that?
We were ahead of you. Not only we had running water, we had floods. But it did not introduce me to the world as much as I think growing up in a city would have, with this exception. There was an organization called the Canadian Weekly Newspapers Association. My family was very active in it. My dad presided, my grandfather presided, and they held an annual meeting every year. And every time that the meeting was in Western Canada, we had local editors from all over the country sort of stop in on the way by. I don't know, it was our personality, more likely that there was scotch available. So I encountered these people from little towns, places I'd never heard of, and I had a sense of awareness of a larger world. But as I look back, it was a quite limited childhood in its reach, but a pretty generous one in its perspective.
You wanted to get out.
I didn't really want to get out. There wasn't a lot I could do to stay, and I went away to to do other things and got caught up in other things. My High River connection is very, very strong. That is where I'm from. It's changed. The town's changed a lot, but that's where my roots are. That's where my formation was. I went on to other things.
How'd you get involved in the PC party? You know, like young people, like I was the one person in my high school that was interested in politics. We're mutants when we get involved in politics at a young age.
I won a speaking contest run by Rotary when I was 16. And interestingly, there were two options. One was to go to the United Nations for a week. The other was to go to Ottawa for a week. And for reasons I don't fully understand, I went to Ottawa for a week.
Good.
And it happened that when I arrived in Ottawa, was during the period of the Great Pipeline debate. And I remember we had a great program run by Rotary for the kids who came there. But I kept trying to get into the House of Commons, and of course you couldn't. And the Rotarians who were looking after us knew I wanted to do that. And one of them on a Friday afternoon said, there's been a break in the line, you can get in. So I whisked down there, I got in, and of course, it was private members hour. And the discussion was not the pipeline, but it was about the extension of 2 miles of, I guess it would be CP rail line between Princess and Patricia in southeastern Alberta. So I learned a bunch of realities that time, but that caught my interest. My mother was an active Liberal, had been an active CCFer in college. My dad was a traditional Conservative. His uncle had been a member of Parliament back at the turn of the century. We had those strong connections. But we were in a social credit area. I mean, we were, the national parties were not very competitive then. What's interesting is that there were partisans of all parties in town. The differences were not sharp. When a kid from the town was going to the capital, I got names from everybody. The Liberals put me in touch with Senator Donald Cameron, who'd run the Banff Centre. I had long lists from everybody. And so I came at an exciting time, and I guess that locked me into a path that would be at least an interest. I didn't think a profession, but at least an interest.
Was it hard for you to get the nomination when you ran?
Well, I ran twice. I ran I became very close to Peter Lougheed. My dad was one of two people who nominated him for the leadership. And I became, in effect, his field organizer. And one of my jobs was to get candidates everywhere. And our really good guy in Calgary South hired a pollster. Nobody else could hire pollsters. The pollster told him that this was the worst riding for a challenger that he'd ever seen. So he, being a practical guy, dropped out. And I needed to fill the hole, and the best person I could find to do it was me. The Progressive Conservative Party had 6 members in that riding. The High River Times had 47 subscribers, and I recruited them all, won the nomination. That was easy. The next one was in Rocky Mountain, a huge, wonderful riding that stretched from the Peace River country down the mountains to the U.S. border. And there were 2 or 3 other people interested in it. We had a superb member of Parliament, Alan Solatiky, Liberal, went on to the court in Alberta. But after my time in Ottawa with Robert Stanfield, I had a pretty good reputation in the party in Alberta. And so there were 2 or 3 ridings where I could have run. I thought a young MP would have the more chance to do more things representing a rural riding. So I took on Rocky Mountain, which included a lot of the area west of High River, a lot of the ranch land and other places up there. And it was a contested nomination. It was difficult. We had 10 meetings. We had to move the ballot box around. It was in this time of the year. We were snowstormed out of meetings, all these kinds of things. Yeah. So that was physically tough. but I won easily, and the party came together, and on we went.
So in those days, it wasn't an automatic for a Conservative to get elected in Alberta because you might lose to a Socret. Is that the reality?
It was social credit for a long, long time. Diefenbaker won 2 or 3 seats in his first election, several second. The Socred party stayed around for a while, but parties were different beasts then. Parties were far more open. The fact that when a kid left High River to go for a week in Ottawa, people of all the parties came together to send their names, was pretty typical of the time. We were not necessarily contestants with one another. We found a lot of common ground. There weren't deep ideological differences. So the parties were. Now the parties became quite strong after Lougheed. I was an activist in the PC party in Alberta before Peter Lougheed was. He'd been interested, but I was out actually organizing, and there had been, after Mr. Diefenbaker won, there was a sense that we could win a national election. That was enhanced by the fact that Duff Roblin had overturned events and had won a Manitoba election. And so we had a leadership campaign that I became involved in. I was 18, 19. And a fellow who was 10 years my senior, a fellow named Alan Lazert, came out of nowhere, not really nowhere. His dad had been the Dean of Education at U of A. And he was a charming, charismatic guy. There were 7 candidates, 6 establishment and Al, and we pushed them to the absolutely final ballot. It was quite funny. Anyway. Cam Kirby, a wonderful man who won the leadership, knew he had to get somebody from the other side, and I was the safest one, so I became his driver. Anybody who's seen me drive would think that. but that's what I did. And that introduced me to the province. Some interesting things as I look back on it. We attracted a lot of first-class people. There was a sense the province needed a change. And an awful lot of them had served in the armed forces. It was quite interesting. It makes sense. This was 1959. They'd come back from war. They'd established themselves in their lives, in their communities. The other thing was that we increased our vote total from about 4% to 25%, and our seat total from 3 seats to 1. So it was not a spectacular success, but it was a wonderful introduction to the province, to life. I think it probably put me on a track where I thought I could find interesting options.
All right. How many Herle Burlyites' eyes glaze over when you're exposed to the minutiae of corporate balance sheets and investment reporting? Yeah, I'm with you. But despite its unsexiness, it is meaningful and often really telling stuff. Like this not so insignificant factoid. TELUS employees are TELUS's 4th largest shareholder group, with full voting rights. So what does this mean in real life? Plenty. First of all, many of us have seen how some companies control all voting shares and shut shareholders out of decision-making, including team members. They keep it all pretty tight and in the family, don't they? TELUS team members, however, have a real voice in decision-making. Let me underline that. Because they're owners with voting rights, they are major contributors to how the company moves forward with its social purpose. For example, TELUS is a leader in rural connectivity and all the benefits that brings, in part because team members often come from, live in, and care deeply about the success of their rural communities. Healthcare access and innovation, technologies that dramatically improve both our farming practices and our food chain, the ability to access education and do business from anywhere. On top of that, in 2021 alone, TELUS's giving included $90 million in charitable giving, representing more than 5% of TELUS's pre-tax profit, and 1.3 million hours of volunteer work. TELUS also contributed over $1.6 million to emergency response efforts in 2021, not to mention supporting thousands of low-income Canadians to get connected on low-cost, high-speed internet and wireless programs. All of that, and there's more than I've been able to briefly mention, is driven by the TELUS team, which wouldn't be possible if they didn't have a seat at the table. Their passion might not be line listed on the balance sheet or in a fourth quarter results report, but it's in there, it's felt there, and it's what makes TELUS the collective success that it is. Let's jump forward to 1976. You, at an astonishingly young age, decide to run for the leadership of the party. It's a crowded field, as I recall that race. There's some establishment attempt to fix the race because all the King's horses had come together to make Claude Wagner the front runner in the race. You, at a very young age, decide to run and you win. How did that all come together?
Well, I wanted a strong candidate. I looked around for people who I thought could win. My first choice was Peter Lougheed. I spent a lot of time trying to persuade Peter to get into it. And I called together a number of our mutual friends to encourage that to happen. He was adamant that he had made his choices. He was staying provincially, at least for that period. And we began to look at who could best bring the country together. I'd worked for Mr. Stanfield. I had a pretty good knowledge of the party, but I was clearly an outsider. And but I also was able to attract quite an extraordinary group of, really three groups of people. There were some Western Canadians who were prepared to support me, even though there were other Western Canadians there. I had a remarkable young...
Jack Horner ran, didn't he?
Who?
Jack Horner ran, didn't he?
Jack Horner, yeah. Jack Horner ran. And there were others, but I'd met a number of people in the party growing up. You know about this. And some of them, I think at the end of the day said, well, I don't know, they sort of, shucks, I guess it's got to be him. And we came together, but we had a good campaign, came third on the first ballot. I should talk about Flora. I would have supported Flora, and we talked about it. My own view was that the party wasn't ready for Flora, and that if we put all of the forces who found her attractive on a cause that was likely to lose, that would not be good for anybody. She was surprised by our relative rankings in the first ballot. I was surprised by them. But nonetheless, that breaking of votes caused a lot of people to come to me. And what's interesting about it is that whatever attempts there might have been to rig a result, it was the most unrigged convention that I've ever heard of, in fact, in Canadian politics. It genuinely was. First of all, the delegates who came, in fact, represented the whole of the country. And they did that geographically, and by and large, they did that in terms of our approach to parties, to governments. In effect, the convention, even before it chose its leader, was in a process of consolidating into something bigger than it had been. And I was the compromise leader, but that meant that I had a high level of acceptability in other places. I remember talking to somebody once in the Albany Club in Toronto, not my natural grazing ground at the time. And I said, why in the world did the Albany Club support me as strongly as they did once I was elected? And he said, because you got elected. Right. And that was not simply an Albany Club perspective. The Progressive Conservative Party at the time was a family full of disputes, but a family nonetheless. And if anything, the conduct of the campaign and the excitement of the convention reinforced that family movement. So I'm not saying it was easy. It wasn't easy at all. And of course, there was a huge part of the country, largely in Quebec, that while it had two strong candidates in the race, was fairly new to the family and did not have, and the number of Quebecers who were present at that convention did not immediately translate into the proportion of Quebecers who would support us. On the contrary. But the family as it was, which was a pretty national, weak in Quebec family, had come to a decision, and it lived with the decision, and it respected differences. It's a very, very different circumstance from national political parties today, as you can see, which tend to be more focused upon differences in the country, less inclined to reconcile, and in many cases, it's too strong to say blind in one eye, but their sight in the eye of things they prefer is stronger than their sight in the eye of things that make them uneasy.
Right.
There's been a failure in national political parties to represent the diverse nation.
So interesting you raise that. I want to get into that in a couple of minutes. There's just a few things about your time in public life I think we should go over for people so that they understand them. You become prime minister, and you, in 1979, and you inherit a humanitarian crisis, a global humanitarian crisis. And I did not know this story. Frankly, just based on stereotypes, I had assumed that Trudeau let the boat people into Canada. And so I did not know this story until I read John Boyko's great book about Canada's role in the Vietnam War. You inherit this humanitarian crisis globally, and you change the whole trajectory of it globally, out of Canada. How did that happen?
Well, I have to say we did it. And there were two big elements in the we. First were my cabinet colleagues, principally two of them, Arnotti, the immigration minister, and Flora MacDonald, the foreign minister. But the other huge we in that response was the Canadian people. They wanted to become involved. It's a very interesting issue in reflection as to what caused that to happen. Because parenthetically, it's worth noting that the huge majority of our sort of chosen in-migration had been from Europe at that time. And here we were reaching out to people not because of their ethnicity, but because of their humanity. And we're reaching out to embrace them. And I think it's now two things about that. One, I think it's fair to say that we knew there was a support for this. We underestimated its strength when we began. We accommodated quickly, and happily, the Parliament, all parties of the Parliament, previous to that period, had introduced the idea of sponsorship, which made all the difference. It meant all sorts of people in various parts of the country. And we felt an obligation to deal with people who were adrift, lives clearly in danger, and we set about it. There's a footnote to that, by the way, which is that a double footnote, taking nothing away from the extraordinary citizen involvement. The other extraordinary actors were the Canadian public servants who were out there doing all these kinds of things. That's point one. Point two was that when they made a mistake, nobody noticed. When they bent a rule, nobody noticed. When they bent a rule in 1979, the bending of the rule did not hold probably immense security implications. But nonetheless, public scrutiny, and I hope we might get into this, public scrutiny makes, it has lots of advantages, but it also makes the life of making decisions for governments in difficult circumstances really very complicated. And one of the advantages, for example, one of our rules was that newcomers had to practice monogamy, one spouse. There's a great true story about a Canadian officer interviewing 4 or 5 people who were about to come together, 2 of whom were the spouses of the same woman. Now, we could have said, the rule would have said, put them aside. He said to the 2 male spouses, which one of you wants to become an uncle? and one stuck up his hand, and the whole family came. If that happened now, it would be all over the media. People, and it wouldn't be all over the media in a celebratory way. People would say they're breaking the rules, this kind of stuff.
Be a Bob Fife scoop on the front page of the Globe. Yeah. Okay. As we are all pretty much aware, these are dyspeptic times in Canada. There is unrest, to put it mildly. For months, we've had to deal with failures in the foreign supply chains we've perhaps unwisely come to depend on so heavily. It's a big reason for spiking inflation, as we've explored on this pod recently. That's costing us all a lot of money. And we've now learned how quickly and easily our vital North American supply chains can be disrupted. The very term supply chains has in fact gone from being economist jargon to the phrase of the year. It's anxiety producing. I guess that's the best way to put it. But our sponsor, CN, wants to point out a few things that may be of some comfort. First, the large veins and arteries of our economy are the railroads. Without trains that load and roll and unload on time, commerce and manufacturing would collapse. Grain would sit uncollected in silos, containers would pile up in seaports, minerals and fuels and engine parts and furniture and a startlingly long list of other basic needs would stop arriving. If you think car dealers have low inventory now, I can assure you they'd have nothing but empty pavement in their lots if trains were interrupted. But CN's trains have not been interrupted. They've reliably kept trade alive throughout the pandemic. Yes, in these days of deep cold and heavy snow and ice, safety considerations sometimes force railways to shorten trains and slow them down. There's no way around that. Safety comes first always. But to be clear, CN's trains are rolling, from the Gulf of Mexico up to the Great Lakes and from coast to coast in Canada. They are moving our economy day and night. I've said it here before. You might not see CN's trains very often. They roll through forests and across prairies and over mountains, usually far from public sight. But they are performing a critical public service, and CN is grateful every day for the conscientiousness and tireless hard work of its railroaders. In 2015, we had Trudeau proposed allowing 25,000 refugees into Canada, and that was considered to be bold, and it was controversial in the election campaign of 2015. In 1979, what made you think that a much smaller Canada, a much whiter Canada, would accept 60,000 Asians?
Two factors. We never had majority support. Support for what we did was at its highest at 49%. Some of the opposition was intense, but most of it wasn't. They just said, no, that's not our preference. Secondly, what makes that remarkable story more remarkable was that these were not our normal immigrants. I mean, we had been a European country primarily, and that embraced a lot of diversity. But the people who came here the boat people who came here were not at all like previous Canadians, and that instead of being an obstacle, was an attraction. It's a quite now and the changing nature of our population, the changing nature of our sources of immigration, is a very interesting challenge for Canada now, because we were drawing from sources like us by and large, and the world now requires fortunate countries like Canada to draw from a much broader world. Our own composition is very interesting. I'm not sure that the law allows asking what is the origin of the large numbers of new Canadians who are coming in now. There may be very good privacy reasons that prohibit that, but I would imagine that Europeans are very much a minority in this. Europeans are used to dominate our in-migration. They are bringing, because we are a proudly multicultural country, they are bringing about a multitude of views, and we principal among countries in the world, are a are a reconciling country. We're not federal simply because it's some whim. We're federal because we had to recognize and embrace a lot of diversity. That was geographic and economic, but it also is social. How are we going to handle that? And I'm not sure that we are in fact, I'm quite concerned that we are not as adept at doing that as we need to be. Interestingly,
Can I ask you a question? Can I ask you a question about that?
Yeah.
So, you're right. We've started accepting people that don't look like us, don't come from similar economic systems or political systems than ours. Some people in this country have a point of view that Canada exists as a construct and that people who come here need to accept that construct and live within that and work within that, and that's what Canada is. You want to come to Canada, you become Canadian. Other people think that, of course, the country evolves depending on who's in it, and that as these people become Canadians, they will shape the country, and the country will evolve over time. Which of those are you more inclined to? What do you think about that?
Sorry, I missed the question.
Which of those two views, what do you think about that? Where do you come down on that? I mean, do we have to be worried about the dilution of Canada?
No, not the dilution of it. We certainly have to focus on the diversity of it. Look, let's go back to our beginnings and let's compare ourselves to the United States. Take two big differences. One is that the American attitude has always been focused on the individual. It is a country of individuals. Our attitude has always been focused on the community. We are a country of communities. We are a much more natural federation than they are. And those communities are not simply geographic. Those communities are very much cultural. Our big failure, we now recognize, although we're not doing much about it, is with our Indigenous people who are culturally different than we, but we nonetheless recognize them as a cultural community. I mean, they were 4 Aboriginal groups were present at in the Charlottetown negotiations. They were there as though they were provinces. So and the other basic reality of the country is that we are a bilingual, officially bicultural country. We have always been prepared to deal with differences. What is the requirement in the future? It is dealing with differences. That's becoming more and more evident as countries that were off our mental map are now becoming front and center again. And among other things are wanting to take advantages of, wanting to shape the world, wanting to come to Canada. That's the reality for which we are better prepared than most countries, including certainly the much admired United States, whose apprehension about newcomers is not new. We have been we Canadians, with our approach to this broad community, have been far more open to the world than we were before. Is there anxiety now? Yes, there is. Is it increasing? Yes, it is. Is it easy to address? No, it isn't. But it is very much, not only in our tradition in some kind of arid sense, that is what we have done since we became a country. We have embraced differences, and more than embrace it, we have respected it to a degree that is not unique, but substantial in the world. Now, does history apply today? Are people conscious of that? All of this happened. All of this happened before social media, and social media has the advantage and the disadvantage on focusing people on their very particular interest. Yes. They try to shape their particular world and pursue their particular goals. The world is larger than your goals or my goals or your world or my world. And we have to find ways in which we make it work. We're better structured if we try. We're better structured to do that than other countries are. That, in fact, taking nothing away from our economic challenges and our economic prowess, that model of how people live successfully together, of how communities function, that's the Canadian. That's the great Canadian potential gift to the world. We have to work at respecting it at home, but that is our defining advantage. And in a world like ours, there could not be a more important one. and the other thing I have to say is that this is not a motto to preach. This is an approach to life to practice. And we are getting more and more into a preach mode than a practice mode. And unless we change it, that's going to be our undoing.
Yeah. How many times do you hear people say, that's not what Canada is?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So you've mentioned communities a couple of times. And in 1979, there was a fair cleavage in perspective between you and Pierre Trudeau, who was, seen as an advocate of a strong central government and a strong centralized federation. And you described your vision in those days as Canada as a community of communities. Am I getting that right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. What did you mean by that?
Well, as a simple description of who we are a federation. We have powers distributed to various parts. We are required to reconcile with others more than most nations do. I don't dispute federalism, not at all. I think it's essential to us, but I think that there has to be a respect for difference. And there has to be a sense that people come from different bases and are influenced by the bases that they come from. In part, my view was influenced by the fact that I came from Western Canada, that while that was not seen as the central part of the country for a long, long time. Even after we became active and productive members of the region, it was easy to treat us as out there and not at the center of things. The more I traveled the country, the more I became aware of the importance of local identities in various parts of the world. So why wasn't talk changing in terms of a community of community, which I believe we are, which is a view to which I hold? That is not in contrast to a strong functioning federalism. It talks about a sensitive federalism, one that takes account of very real differences. I find it kind of interesting that there is a debate now, for reasons we both understand, about the notwithstanding clause. One of the realities about the notwithstanding clause was that it was a Western Canadian, I was going to say demand. That isn't the right word. It was a Western Canadian point of view put into the Constitution. It wasn't just Sterling Lyons and Peter Lougheed. It was the CCF premier, of the NDP premier of Saskatchewan, Alan Blakeney. Mm-hmm. It was a regional point of view because it reflects the regional reality of the country. And I think that in a world which is unquestionably global, none of us can escape globalism. We all nonetheless have roots. We are who we are in the world. We are who we are at home. A respect for those roots, of those differences, the richness of different communities that influence. That's fundamentally critical. So it's not an insurrectionist view. It is one that requires much more consultation, much more attempts to understand what we don't naturally understand, and to govern with that kind of empathy.
Does it mean water in your wine? Does it mean water in your wine? Let me give you an example. Does it mean that the Trudeau government, appropriately committed to fighting climate change, in my point of view, should nonetheless be constructing a policy in a way that's more sensitive to the economies of Alberta and Saskatchewan?
Yes, it means that. Yes, it means that. But it doesn't mean abandoning our climate goals. No, it need not mean that. One of the climate change issue is interesting. I can't speak as authoritatively with the authority I should have about the degree to which some of the Western Canadian major companies are themselves adapting internally. one of Canada's strongest think tanks is the Canada West Foundation, which is now putting a lot of attention on precisely this issue with a lot of support in the community. But it's done under a sense of harassment. It should be done under a sense of innovation and a sort of a triumph. But that's exactly the kind of thing we have to do. You have to come together and try to find goals that, on the one hand, are essential. Another way for essential is unavoidable. We have to do these things. But on the other, tries to find a consensual way to go forward. You know, I don't want to dwell too long on my Charlottetown experience, because Charlottetown, at the end of the day, went to a referendum and it failed. And Charlottetown, and the result that came out of Charlottetown, had lots of weaknesses in it. Nobody knows that better than I do and the others who were part of it. But the fact is that Charlottetown, which drew together all of Canada's formal governments, territories as well as provinces and the federal government, and drew together the four major representative Indigenous groups, found a unanimous agreement on every one of our proposals. That's not to say they were all genius proposals. They weren't. They had lots of weaknesses. But the unanimity was extraordinary. And if I may say so, part of the reason there was unanimity was that we took the time. And part of it was, we had an interesting rule about what we'd say to the media. The rule was that at the end of each public meeting, I, as the chair, would go out and give a fairly bland, but not inaccurate, summary of what went on. And every head of delegation, every premier, attorney general, chief in that group had the right to come up after me and say, Mr. Clark was wrong on this. No one ever did, because we were careful about that. And because as the discussions went on in this diverse, divided country, the instinct in that room to come together grew. And we began to look for ways in which we could find agreement. I don't hold out the model or the necessary contents of Charlottetown as the future, but certainly that process was one that, and I have to say...
Was Mulroney surprised you got a deal?
Was Mulroney surprised? Yeah, I think he probably was. What's more interesting is that there were a lot of people in Ottawa who wish I'd quit early. There was a, I don't want to say they, because I was the minister. I was the minister with unusual standing and authority for various reasons, obviously, but I was the minister. But I put to the side a lot of the conventional rules of how these things work. I kept it going longer than it should. That caused a lot of resentment astonishment around the system. Probably more skepticism than support. But all of that, nonetheless, meant that we had a unanimous agreement on a very imperfect proposal. As imperfect as I won't say this. I was going to say as imperfect as Confederation was when it was formed. something that had to be added to as it went on, had to be amended as it went on. And I think that capacity is there. My nostalgia tells me that there were times when people with sharp differences got together and in public fora found agreement. You know,
okay, so I want to drill on this with you. Because you found elite accommodation to a package of ideas that would address a variety of issues, grievances around the country. And you brought authority figures together, establishment, institutional figures together, and you kept them in a room long enough that they all agreed on something. That was not replicable in the public domain. The lesson that I learned from your experience at Charlottetown is that Canada doesn't work if we look under the hood. That it is a matter of elite accommodation, and that across the country there are wide divergences in what Canadians believe about the country, what they believe about other parts of the country, what they're prepared and what they're not prepared to accommodate. And we're better as a country when these things are not debated than when they are. Am I wrong?
Another way to put that is there a way for the elites to earn respect? And in fact, in a lot of our history, the elites carried respect. Wasn't the same respect in every part, but they carried respect. And indeed, going back to the notwithstanding clause, when respected elite leaders, 3 of them, decided we need this to get this, that was reluctantly, no doubt, but nonetheless that was accepted. So now elites are on the one hand a fiction. They're sort of people you're against, but on the other hand, they're essential. You don't get things done unless there are elites. And this question of elite accommodation, this instinct towards elite accommodation, has served us very well for a long, long time. And it is very easy, but there's no guarantee that its longevity means it's going to work.
Political parties have abandoned the role.
Parties have abandoned them.
Each of our parties would be unrecognizable to anybody from the 70s. Unrecognizable.
That's right. Yeah. Our parties have abandoned the role. Our parties were, they've abandoned a couple of roles. I learned more about my country through my political party than I did through anything else. Here I was, a progressive conservative from some little town in southern Alberta, and I would go to national conventions and I would meet people from whose languages I didn't speak, who came from places I'd never heard of before.
Me too, it's great.
And what did we have in common? What we had in common was that we were members of the same party. So we went out for a drink together, or we did this, or we did that together. And we became friends despite our differences. Great phrase for Canada, friends despite our differences. But the parties made that happen. And the party in which you grew up was very, very diverse. The party in which I grew up was very diverse. The party Ed Broadbent led was a deliberately and effectively diverse party. Those felt. I had the privilege of working for Robert Stanfield. One of the wisest things Robert Stanfield said as he left office was that the role of interest groups was gradually eroding and replacing the role of political parties. Because what interest groups had been able to do was reconcile the multitude of interests, most of them legitimate, some of them not, that exist in any kind of human society. And the party took it as a role, and it was seen as their function to reconcile those sorts of things. So I learned all sorts of things about different points of view, and you did too, and people in the NDP in Ed's time did too. That doesn't happen now. I can recall debates where people who were usually in a minority and had argued a long time came to an agreement. They said, well, I don't like doing this, but okay, we've heard the arguments, I've had my say, let us go and do this. So there was an instinct to agree. And that instinct was rooted in an institution that all of us respected. We liked different things about it, but all of us respected. And now that doesn't happen anymore. Now the interest is more important than the community. And that is the case across the board. And it affects your vision. It affects what you talk about. It affects the way you talk. I mean, one of the things, it's not just a question of language. It's not a question of French or English language. There's a language of the woke that is not only incomprehensible, but offensive to a lot of the non-woke in the world. And there's this, and one can find all sorts of, I think part of what was upsetting about the demonstration we've just seen was the shrillness. Shrillness has always existed, I guess, but it's never been a part of reasonable conversation. And all these things are now happening. Can we do anything about this? I absolutely believe we can, but I see no will to doing it. And I see no party in Canada today that is prepared to take the breadth of view, that is prepared to practice the Canadian talent for reconciliation that is necessary.
Well, okay, so we'll get to the Liberals, but let's start with the Conservatives. Why has conservatism become so right-wing in North America? Like, I had a guy named Stuart Stevens, who's a longtime Republican and part of the Lincoln Project thing on this podcast, and he was making the point that, you know, the speech that George W. Bush gave at, no great liberal, by the way, but the speech that George W. Bush gave at the 2000 Republican convention would be wholly unacceptable at a Republican convention now. You can't talk about immigration that way. You can't talk about compassion and social programs and education that way. It's changed so much. And I think that's true in Canada as well. It's evidently the case that neither you nor Robert Stanfield nor probably even Brian Mulroney would be remotely attractive to this party as a leader.
Yeah. Two things here. One of these, I bridle at Canada-US distinctions because I think that, again, there is the individualist tradition in the United States that is at the core of their being. And there is a more communitarian instinct in Canada that is at the core of our being. There are going to be a lot of characteristics in the same places, but I am not prepared to take sort of American evidence in Canadian as a Canadian guide. A very interesting little tidbit in the news just the other night in the region you and I both came from, near Coutts, Alberta.
Yeah.
It was found that there was a store of firearms, and all of us jumped to the view, oh, the Americans supplied the arms. Well, they didn't supply the arms. The stories came out yesterday indicating that they're people from towns very close to where I grew up that were carrying the arms, so we want to the difference is about more than the U.S. border and what set up two countries on the other side of it. But the parties themselves, used to accept a reconciling role. There have been two great internal changes. One is that the nature of the broad nature of people who are attracted to both parties has been replaced by a narrow nature. There is not but the other thing that happens is that parties matter less now. Parties as institutions have been stripped of most of their responsibilities. Liberal
Party is a movement now, whatever that is. It's not a party, it's a movement now.
It's also, it's a movement, but it's you said you wanted to talk about the Conservatives, and I understand that. And this is not a diversion from that. Where did the Trudeau ministers come from? How many of them came from the party? How many of them had any sort of sense of party or parliamentary or political experience before they came to high office?
Dominic LeBlanc and Ralph Goodale would be about it, I would say.
Yeah, right. That's right. And I don't want to repeat old refrains about the strength of the PMO and the PCO, except that they are absolutely correct. The growth of those two organizations, their influence upon public policy, their exclusion of able people from outside is quite amazing. I look at the 2015 election. If you took a look at the names that were showcased by Justin Trudeau as he was running, they were Jody Wilson-Raybould, they were Scott Bryson, they were 5 or 6 people who are no longer there. Why are they no longer there? Some different reasons. The common reason is that their view became, they felt they couldn't get their view through the armament around PCO, PMO. That's a terrible situation, all the more so if it's not recognized. And I'm not sure that it's recognized. Right. Would that happen in another party? Yes, it certainly could. It could certainly happen in a party that is not inclined in its own internal work to reconcile. And certainly the Conservative Party, there's plenty of reason to believe, and I'm far from an insider now on it, that the talents and the interest in reconciliation are pretty scant in that party. It's more a mission party than it is a nation party, and those are, and I think the same kind of comparable criticisms can be made of the other parties. The Bloc doesn't want the whole. It doesn't need to deal with that. The NDP isn't sure what it wants to do. Its present course began when it wanted to get rid of Tom Mulcair, a very successful leader by most objective standards. And it's so we are in a situation where the institutions that can affect real change, that have affected real change in the past, are not doing that now.
It is. Nobody seems to be trying to get as much support as they possibly can anymore. Mm-hmm. People seem to be trying to identify a core of people who, if highly motivated to get out to vote, can get them across the finish line in a first past the post system, as opposed to what's the biggest number of votes we can get here.
That's true. That is what is happening. The other thing that's happening is that more and more of the membership of various parties have more loyalty to a particular interest, call it, than they do to the success of the party. There is, I don't know many members of the present Conservative caucus. I know some of them. I've met two or three who are really bright, but are sort of guided by lights from another different universe than I am. I have the sense that if those people and I had been together in a caucus in the 1980s or 1990s, we would have been able to find some common ground. Now, as you say, the instinct is the other way. And David, that is a terrible indictment of not only our political parties, it's a terrible indictment of our future, because going back to the question of reconciliation, the country was formed to reconcile variety in order to take account of some shared common challenge. That's what we were about. And right. We knew that we had to keep the commonality, the community together as much as we can. We had to make it grow. That was the impulse that guided the way parties operated for a long, long time. And again, Robert L. was right. Parties have fallen away. Interests have moved to the fore. Yet, parties were always involved in the reconciliation of interests. One can certainly say that there were a lot of interests they didn't bother to reconcile. They were not interested in Indigenous issues. For a long time, they weren't really interested in issues of identity, of women's rights. But they have that has changed. They have that capacity now. Why have they all become as narrow as they have? And what can be done about it? Because it doesn't matter if you can win majority elections year after year, if other forces in the country cause you to become a startling signal of things not working, which is exactly what has happened to Canada in the last 10 to 12 days. I'm not blaming anybody here. I'm simply saying that that this country, whose great apprehension was that nobody noticed us, here we were trucking along, but suddenly we are an example of how quickly things appear to go wrong. That's our fault, because they are going wrong here, but it's also an unfair caricature, and it is an immensely unproductive caricature for a country like ours. So
when you look at something like the protest, do you think there's more crazy people than there used to be, or do you think our institutions have atrophied in their ability to deal with it?
Certainly our institutions have atrophied. I think there are a lot more, in fact, I think there are a lot more people who were more thoughtful. Their library, if their library has shelves, they draw books from only one row on that shelf, and they dig deep into it. A lot of these people think they've talked about it one to another. I think they think they've thought about it. I mean, I think there's nothing is ever easy, but I think if we put more emphasis upon how we can sit down and draw people together than how we can define our interests as separate from theirs, we can go a long way forward. And that, by the way, has been the Canadian tradition. That is what Confederation is about. That is what federalism is about. That is what the national parties were about for a long time.
Absolutely. It does not sound to me like Pierre Poilievre's platform, though.
No, it doesn't. And I've no way of knowing. I don't know the party anymore. As to in the party I knew, that would go nowhere. In this party, who knows? Right.
So, give me a few minutes on the Trudeau government. I mean, there's this talk these days that there's rootless homeless political people from the center who used to be blue liberals or red Tories or however they used to be described, and that these people are now politically homeless. They're probably talking about you, and maybe they're talking about me. And so, as one of those centrist red Tories, what is your view of the Trudeau government?
One view.
Why aren't you comfortable there? Why wouldn't that be your new home? Conservatives have gone. Yeah. Why wouldn't that be your new home?
When Justin Trudeau was first leader, with some apprehensions, I was interested in what he might do, and we'd had a couple of conversations, and he's been generous towards me in a couple of in asking my opinion on a couple of things. There's a sense in which I'm not sure he has the. Let me step back a moment. Let me step back to an unfair comparison to Robert Stanfield. When Robert Stanfield became the national leader of the PC party, he, on the one hand, had a quite remarkable understanding of the parts of the country from which he didn't come. But secondly, he had a deep understanding of the importance of those parts of the country which seemed to be opposed to things he was thinking about. On the question of Quebec independence, for example, he knew its threats to Canada, but he surrounded himself. He went out to consult people who were not way over on the other side, but who understood the other side and who understood how that could be accommodated. Why was that? That was because he came to office prepared to lead a diverse community. He'd been doing it in a sense as a premier, but it was also in his nature. He did it as an intellectual. And one way as another, going back again to our earlier conversation about what you and I both learned in our different national parties, he came to an office understanding what the party was about. I think there's a real sense in which Justin Trudeau was denied that opportunity. He grew up a Dauphin in a party. I think his father increasingly learned what a party was about, but he never really understood in the way that a Mackenzie King or even a Lester Pearson learned. You know, it's quite interesting about Pearson. I'm invited from time to time into classes to discuss on the record of their accomplishments who were the great prime ministers. Lester Pearson by a mile. He just got great things done, and he did it with a minority government. But he did it because he respected people who had views different from his own. He let them fight it out. I mean, one of the great incidents of Liberal Party and thus Canadian history was that when there was a severe difference about the direction of economic policy, that wasn't fought out in the media. That was fought out in the Liberal Party of Canada, with Walter Gordon and Mitchell Sharp heading off in a a sanctified discussion that had consequences. And I don't know what Pearson at least condoned that, and but Pearson's sort of breadth of mind. And now one of the unfortunate habits is that when you're looking for people to run as candidates, you look for people who are already personalities in their own domain. That's a good thing. But do they know anything about the domain they're entering? And I'm not sure that question is very often asked. And I know better than anyone, as a person who's won nominations. The nomination process is not you can't guarantee it. But when one runs, as I did, in a riding that had was the 16th largest in Canada, that had to have 10 nomination meetings to choose a candidate, that had 2,000 or 3,000 people take part in that nomination process in 10 different places, you're probably getting close to a consensus, some kind of consensus as to what you're looking at. It's the era now. I mean, what we're dealing with is how we adjust to a different set of circumstances, the factors that define or influence this conventional era. Some of the current Trudeau ministers, about whom I'd never heard before, and who don't seem to have had a great party tradition, are performing very well as ministers. I'm very impressed by the new Minister of Health. I just think he's doing very well. Yeah. He probably wouldn't have brought those qualities had he been a long time sort of party dealer. And you have to reach out to draw people in from other demands, but you also have to have a core of people who know who know more about parties if parties are going to retain their essential function of representing a broader view than any leader can represent himself or herself.
Right. The two parties have always been a little different that way, and that the Conservatives have always, I think it's really pronounced now, but the Conservatives have always had a funnel from staffer right to the top of elected office, whereas the Liberal Party kind of streams people into you're a backroom operative or you're an elected person pretty early. We have never had a leader who was ever a staffer.
Well, it's not interesting. I mean, it would be interesting to take a look at the I think that it is true of the Conservative Party that I don't want to use the word grandees because that's but people who had sort of social status had an unusual influence upon the party for a long time, and often a very good one. I mean, the long ago Port Hope Conference in 1941-42 transformed the Conservative Party to deal with the CCF then challenge, and it was really directed by quite establishment people who nonetheless had their eyes open to the future. But if we're going to talk about how the parties and the systems function now, we have to take a look at the features of this contemporary era. And one of the most important is social media. I guess this raises another question. Need social media sort of be the enemy of order? Or is it better to look at it as the instrument of change? But anyway, whatever the right questions are, there is a real need in this country for people who have some experience of how political parties have served the nation, particularly in the more recent past, how that might apply to these circumstances, because now we're drifting. I've no idea who all the people were who took part in the so-called Freedom Caravan. And we're all inclined to say, do you really know what freedom is about? And et cetera, and et cetera, and et cetera. The point is that there are all sorts of people turning out for this kind of thing. And some of them are carrying firearms, as the Coots discovery indicated. But should that caricature the movement? I mean, what's going on here? What other options did they have? Some of these people were are inclined to be off the wall anyway. But a lot of people who end up off the wall started in a more reliable place. So I think we've got some contemporary institutional problems, challenges that we have to look at. And the great warning of what's gone on with the so-called Freedom Convoy is how many people went to the other side. I know the polling indicates that there's more anger than support, but there were an awful lot of people who showed some kind of sympathy for this. Even people who went down to make sure that the kids who shouldn't have been in the truck cabs had some help or had some food or this kind of thing.
Right.
We're facing some, I don't want to say institutional failures, although that's probably the more accurate word. We're dealing with some serious institutional deficiencies in our country now, and they have to be faced. Because if they're not faced, we're going to get worse.
So there's a guy named Chris Arnotti, who I have talked to a couple of times on the podcast. He's an American. He was a Wall Street banker who started getting stressed about his job and taking walks through Manhattan. His walks started to take him into neighborhoods he wasn't supposed to be in. The walks became more interesting than his job. And now that's what he does, is he goes and he walks working class or poorer neighborhoods of communities and tries to figure out what's going on with those people and in those communities. He wrote a fantastic book called Dignity. And for him, that would be at the core of it. I'm paraphrasing him, and he may be angry about it. But essentially, I think what he would say is, as we, in a meritocracy sort of way, designate the ideal person to be university educated, have all the correct views on social issues and equity issues and identity issues, be career oriented and not community oriented, travel anywhere for the right job, all these kinds of, as we as a society say, this is sort of the model person. If you could be anybody, you would want to be this. That we're stripping everybody else of their dignity. The people who value home over career, the people who want to stay in High River, the people who don't want to be a university educated person, that there's no dignity for those people in our society anymore. What do you think about that?
Oh, I think that's I think the question about that is, okay, so what do you do about it? And I think that's the big question. But I think that's absolutely true. And it's, and there's a sense in which it's always been true. I mean, I knocked on a lot of doors everywhere, but in particularly, I knocked on a lot of rural Western Alberta doors. And I found a remarkable range of people who were, I don't mean this in a soppy way, who were satisfied with their lives, but were making their best at it. They were relatively happy in their lives because they thought they were doing important things, and they were free to do those important things. And I learned from, I can't confess I went home and wrote everything I learned in a little notebook, but day by day I began to learn more about some of those attitudes. Would those people be different today? Probably, because they're subject to sort of fits of depression or zeal as the rest of us do, and they've been cut off from it before, perhaps. But
they watch Fox News now.
Yeah. So there is a question as to how we might go about this. We've got to move from observation of these phenomena to doing something about it. And I'm not at 82 in my peak years of doing something about things, but there are a lot of people who I think would be. There's a lot of concern about this, and it's an interesting question. I watched the suddenly multi-ministered aggregation who were announcing the invocation of the act. And it's been a long time since I've seen so many ministers on the stage with the prime minister with actual speaking roles, which is to say we all learn things. And maybe some lessons are being learned. Our instinct is to sort of strike out at the people whose activities most annoyed us. And a lot of those we're not going to be able to bring into any reasonable circle. But everybody in Canada is worried about this. And we wouldn't know what to do in ordinary circumstances, but we're still in lockdown mode. I look out my window at huge snowdrifts. But we got to get over that. We got to find some ways in which these serious things can be talked about. We've also got to find some ways in which, if it's possible, in which those discussions can be relatively private. One thing I wanted to say about this, about the question of privacy, was I was minister during Tiananmen Square, and what happened in Tiananmen Square is the only time in the House of Commons in a quarter century there that I can remember members of all parties actually crying on the floor of the House. They were so shocked by what had happened to China, in which perhaps they had too much confidence into the kids who were literally facing death in tanks. And we needed to do something about it. And a couple of my extraordinary officials in then External Affairs suggested that it would be possible for us to convene a group of about 100 representative Canadians, people ranging all the way from classmates of the kids in the way of the tanks to people with other legitimate interests, a broad range of interests, and call them to Ottawa and say, extraordinary circumstance here. What do you think we should do about it? And the two public servants who spoke to me said, Mr. Minister, your function is to chair, not speak. These people are not there to hear from you. You're there to hear from them. And moreover, there will only be 2 external affairs people in the room of 100. And we gathered them together in privacy, and we had a very wide-ranging conversation, and we came up with a series of measures that took some discussion back and forth, but nonetheless outlined a path that we could follow to Tiananmen Square. I took it literally the next day to the Prime Minister, who agreed. We took it into Cabinet, they agreed, and we implemented it. And I don't know that anybody knew it was happening. And certainly no journalist, to my knowledge, asked any of the participants, what discord was there? But that we found a way in those circumstances that were far less open, I guess, now than the modern world, to get an action plan on a crisis that proved to be, nothing's perfect, proved to be more durable than almost any other government's approach to the challenge of Tiananmen Square. We need to start looking at ways in which we can make things that worked in the past work in the present. And among other things, that means turning some distance away from the lamentation about how awful everything is, because that doesn't get us very far. Now, I don't know what
I'll give you an opportunity to do that. I'll give you an opportunity to do that. Because we got to wrap up, but I want to say to you that when we had our pre-conversation about this, we had a good long yak about a bunch of things. And at the end of it, you said, this is really depressing. And I said, don't all conversations these days end with somebody saying, this is really depressing. So you've just told us we've got to stop lamenting and get on with doing things about it. So what makes you optimistic? If you're optimistic right now, what are you optimistic about?
what makes me optimistic is that when I was able to walk out of my backyard in High River, Alberta, and look to the west, I saw the Rocky Mountains. I mean, this sounds but I think I was born or raised an instinctive optimist. I know a lot of people who aren't. And I think we have to look for the optimist, because it's certainly easy to find fault with things. Faults and weaknesses are all over the place. And what we have to look for are some constructive building blocks, and then ask ourselves, okay, this is what we have. What can we build with them? What can we do that needs to be done? And conversations like this, in fact, are quite helpful to us, because they're always a little surprising. They open our thoughts to things that could be done. In terms of sort of creative change, there are a lot of organizations in the world that have been engaged in that, following methods that no longer work. We're not the only ones, I'm saying. And some of those others in quite unrelated fields may provide some evidence to this. Really some terrible things happening by inadvertence in the world. I mean, I had a chance to look at at a document that the Inter-American Dialogue will be releasing in a couple of weeks on the state of stability in the Americas, principally south of the Rio Grande. And there has been a fairly generalized deterioration. And the dialogue is raising issues about what might be done about this. That's what they exist to do, but they have eyes open that the problems they thought they were facing 15, 20 years ago are different ones now. And they're an organization, but it might be worth looking around for clusters of others who are not ignorant, but are optimistic, are looking for the possibility of better news rather than getting weighted down by the prevalence of worse news, and just see what might be done about specific issues. I mean, whether that has to do with the functioning of political parties, whether it has to do with how one deals with social media, how it can be turned, as it is in so many cases, be turned to more constructive purposes. But I think these and lots of people are doing this, but are doing it in some way or another. They tend to get locked into issues. I mean, some very interesting creative work is being done and creative things happening in discussions of green issues. Some really quite interesting things are being done, are emerging. So who else is confronting these new order problems more effectively than we are? And what might we do? Thank you for your time.
Wow, thank you. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, that was the Right Honourable Joe Clark, one of the most important and impactful people in Canadian history. Can't tell you how thrilled I was to have this conversation with you. You know, we've never, up until we decided to do this pod, we didn't really have a chance to know each other over life, but I've certainly been a deep, deep follower and admirer of yours, and I know many people that love you to death. So thank you for doing this show. I've got some sponsors to thank. Our presenting sponsor is TELUS, and our other sponsor is CN Rail. Thank them both for their support of public affairs in this podcast. Hurley Burlyites will see you next week with probably not as good a guest.
Thanks. Pleasure. Great pleasure.
Thank you, Mr. Clark.